Welcome. In this episode, we will begin unit number 4 on absolutism, the Enlightenment, and the Scientific Revolution. This period roughly corresponds to the late 15, but mainly the 16 and 1700s. In our study of absolutism and the rise of absolute monarchs in Europe, we will be looking at three dynasties or three case studies: the Spanish Habsburgs, 2, the French Bourbons, and 3, the Stuarts in Britain. First, as a study of absolutism, we are talking about in this period of the 1600s primarily, where kings actually gain power. One of the things that I like to explain is that history, despite what we sometimes think, does not always move in a straight line. Progress does not always move inevitably forward. Philosophy and morals do not just always get better. Technology does, but many other aspects of humanity do not. And so we often have this misconception that the further back in history we go, the more power kings had. But that's not entirely true. In the period of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, kings were not, as many people picture, these fairy tale absolute monarchs with total power. In fact, the nobility, the local lords, as well as the church, tended to have quite a bit of power. And in many cases, kings were a first among equals and were very important, even in regards to the church or their nobility. But in this period, we will see kings actually becoming more powerful in the 16 and 1700s at the expense of their own nobility, over whom they exercise more dominance and control, and at the expense of the church. In particular, in many of the Protestant countries, the kings could pick the bishops and had a substantial degree of authority over the church. And as regards the Catholic Church, many of the kings also had a degree of influence over who the Pope would choose to be the bishops in their territory. And we roughly refer to this as Caesaropapism, the idea of a king, or Caesar, exercising a degree of authority over religion. Other things we see in this period of absolutism that goes against what we might often think is many of the middle class are empowered by the rise of their monarchs because it was often the nobility who wanted things to sort of remain the same and to maintain their serfs. So we see the end of serfdom, which is really like a half step up from being a slave, to the idea that land tilling farmers were free peasants as opposed to serfs. Absolutism depends upon the idea of the divine right theory. Divine referring to God, and right meaning their right to rule, that God gave them the right to rule because, unlike, say, if you take a vote, or unlike if you win a war, even then it's debatable. But the idea being, if the oldest son of the previous king, there's no one that made you there. There's no one but God who put you in that position. Therefore, if I am the oldest son of the previous king, no one but God put me there. Therefore, no one else can deprive me of my right to be the next king. And therefore, the king's rule should be absolute or total. We will see in competing ideologies in the Enlightenment period between the idea of a monarch having legitimate authority, meaning it comes from God, it comes from divine right, it comes from birth order, versus popular sovereignty, sovereignty or rule coming from the populace, the people, and more democratic forms of government. Well, let's look at our first case study, the Spanish Habsburgs. If we look here, we have a very grotesque Habsburg family tree going back to Philip the Fair and Juana Loca of Spain. And what I want to focus in on is where we get to the Philip II of Spain over here, who, following in the footsteps of Charles, who was virtually king of the world, ruler of Austria, Spain, the Spanish Empire. And this here's Charles and his son Philip II. Philip II, the same ruler who married Queen Mary I of England, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII. The same Philip who launched the Spanish Armada in 1588. And in a moment, we'll talk about this grand palace he had constructed in Madrid called the Escorial Palace. And notice the grid pattern, that'll come into play in just a moment, as well as the centrality of this structure, which is the church. All right. Speaking about the Habsburg family tree, remember that Charles V had a huge empire from his four very famous, very large land-owning grandparents. He inherited this enormous empire. And after he failed to crush the Protestant reformers, he agreed to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where each prince of the Holy Roman Empire was free to choose Lutheranism or Catholicism for his own territory. As a result, he believed that his enormous empire was too large for any one man to rule. So he gave his Spanish holdings, including southern Italy called Naples, and including all of the New World, all of the lands conquered by Columbus and Cortez and Pizarro and the conquistadors we studied last unit. He gave to his son Philip. But to his brother Ferdinand, he gave all of the continental Austrian land holdings. And from then on, the Habsburgs would kind of be split between these two cousin groups. Then they would be known as the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. But his son Philip II, much more so than his father Charles, rules as an absolute monarch, and by many is said to preside over the height of Spain's golden age, or siglo de oro, age of gold, a period of flourishing of late Renaissance writers and painters. And as Italy had begun to decline, Spain, partly due to its massive wealth from the conquest of the Americas, begins to be a center of world power and intellect and wealth. He also decides to rule as an absolute monarch rather than through his nobility or through his ministers. He made many of the decisions of state personally, himself. He held court in his palace where all sorts of foreign dignitaries and local officials and nobles would come directly to him and required his approval or disapproval of all sorts of matters of state that he decided on personally. And let's break this down into several categories of his rule. One is that he built a brand new palace called the Escorial in Madrid. Spain had very recently been two kingdoms, that of Castile and Aragon. And Aragon was much more of a Mediterranean-centered country, and Castile was much more of an Atlantic-centered country, and they had many large cities and were competing with one another, and he had constructed a new capital at Madrid, which was kind of out of the way and in the middle of nowhere, relatively speaking. It was not on the coast, and this sort of made the nobles and the wealthy merchants and people who sought royal power had to leave their home bases, these other rich areas of Spain, and go to him on his terms. And additionally, about this new palace that he had built, it bleeds into this next aspect of religion. Philip and the Habsburgs were traditionally very devout Catholics and sought to aid the Catholic Reformation and fight Protestantism wherever they could. A couple examples of the devout faith is the centrality and largeness of the church that was constructed within his palace. Additionally, he had it so constructed that his own chamber was only a single door away from being on a balcony of the church, so that he could hear Mass with very little intrusion, which would be going on, and he could join and would hear Mass regularly, if not daily. Furthermore, the actual layout of this grid pattern is meant to honor one of his favorite patron saints, St. Lawrence, who was a martyr and was killed for his Christian faith and was grilled to death. And so this grill pattern, in addition to demonstrating these courtyards that are famous, that are typical in Spanish structures, the grill or grid pattern is meant to honor St. Lawrence, who, while being burned to death on a grill, reportedly his last words were, "Flip me over, I'm done on this side," as he was being grilled to death for his Christian faith. He was a personal hero of Philip, and he built this palace not only with the church in the center, but to honor St. Lawrence with its layout. A key economic aspect of Philip's reign was the enormous, enormous wealth from the New World. Gold, and especially silver, and the enormous trade dominance that Spain was able to establish over the trade with the New World. And this was a gold mine, most literally a silver mine, but the amount of sheer wealth pouring into Spain was astronomical. He was also a leader in several wars. One very famously in pushing back the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, at the naval battle of Lepanto in the central Mediterranean, marked a major turning point in the expansion of the Islamic Turks in the Mediterranean, and marked the ascendancy of Spain even in the Mediterranean. He famously lost against the Dutch, who revolted from Spanish rule, partly on the grounds of religion. Calvinism, a Protestant sect, had really taken off in the Netherlands, and for that and for other reasons, the Dutch revolted against Spanish rule, and due to some other European countries allying with the Netherlands, or the Dutch people, they were successful in gaining independence from Spain at this time. Finally, one of the most famous and unfortunate conflicts for Spain was the Spanish Armada. This was where Philip, having already also been the King of England with his wife Mary Tudor, or Mary the First, remember that he had tried to marry Queen Elizabeth and had hoped to reassert his power as King of England. Failing that, and many decades going by, and realizing that England may be gone for good, he raised a large fleet, or armada, that very famously, unsuccessfully attempted to land an army in England. Never actually landed the army. The conditions were poor, the weather was poor, and the British Navy was both skillful and a little lucky, and they substantially defeated this major Spanish invasion effort. They didn't know it at the time, but looking back, we can use this famous 1588 date to mark kind of a high water mark for the Spanish Navy in the beginning of the ascent, or the rise to power, of the British Navy. And finally, to conclude our case study on the Habsburgs, especially in Spain, let's look at their legacy. And a big part of his legacy was future economic weakness. And one of the big things was inflation, the crippling inflation. It's why when a country's in debt, you can't simply print more money, is then there just is more money, and everyone has more money, therefore prices go up. Because if everyone has $1 million, then even ordinary things will start to cost much, much more. And so the huge influx of wealth and cash into Spain from the New World causes terrible inflation that begins to undermine the Spanish economy. They had a relatively regressive tax system that did not successfully target the wealthy landowners, but hit merchants especially hard. They had a very large petty nobility class, so they had a lot of people claiming nobility, and one of the keys of being a nobleman was you weren't supposed to work very hard, and you had a life of leisure and ease and other people to labor for you, and that's relatively counterproductive toward building a successful economy. And then finally, they had a low incentive to participate in capitalism that was only accelerated by the loss of the Netherlands with the Dutch revolt, because they were among the most prosperous and hardworking territories of the Spanish crown. And what I mean by low incentive to participate in capitalism is they've won the lottery. Anyone who's anyone was participating in this massive influx of wealth from the New World, but they simply use that wealth rather than to build new industries and hire more employees. They simply enjoyed the luxury that came with that, which does not build one's economy in the long run. Next time, we will pick up with case study on absolutism number 2. the French Bourbons. Thanks for watching.